When Lucas Simon, lost Sarah, with whom we had lived together for 5 years, in a plane crash, I barely had the strength to move on with my life. Although my mother and sister were great helpers, it was my longtime friend Jeff Phillips who helped me the most. Jeff had a nice sense of empathy, was always optimistic and encouraging, and involved me in many activities with other male friends and sometimes with his wife Rosalind and other married couples. Sarah's death insurance allowed me to hire some good people to run my PR firm until I could pull my head out of my ass. A year after my wife's death, I felt almost human again, and while I had no desire to start dating, everything else in my life was starting to fall into place. I was actually lucky. I got a major new order for my PR firm, and in my 28th year had more income than I had ever had in my life, and couldn't have even optimistically imagined. While my life changed as much as could have been expected, Jeff continued to suffer from a problem he'd had almost since I met him: bitchiness. What is bitchiness, you ask? In Jeff's case, it was a marriage to a hell of a bitch, the aforementioned Rosalind. Usually, but certainly not always, Rosalind was polite to Jeff when in the company of others. But when alone with him, she was a bossy, uncouth, abusive bitch who used Jeff as her emotional punching bag. Because of Jeff's kind and empathetic demeanor, he went along with it. I and some of Jeff's other friends were certain that she would ultimately be responsible for his demise, as he was showing increasing signs of stress, and despite being only 29 years old, his doctor had prescribed blood pressure medication. After consulting with some of our mutual friends, including a doctor, a lawyer, and an accountant, I arranged for Jeff to meet me in person when we went fishing Saturday morning, despite the objections of the ogre, which I managed to deal with because for some reason she treated me more like an annoying nuisance than as shitty as she treated Jeff and most of our male friends. Since I'm not known for subtlety, I asked head-on to Jeff after his first fling. "Jeff, I've noticed that you're very tense and don't seem to be enjoying life as much as you should. Is it because of the way Rosalind treats you?" He replied with the look of a tame dog. "Is it obvious, Lucas?" "I'm afraid so, pal. I can't understand why you're staying with her." After a long sigh, he looked me in the eye and said, "You're a good friend, Lucas. Can I tell you something in confidence so it won't be passed on to anyone without my permission?" I looked him straight in the eye, made him take his eyes off his floater in the stream, looked me straight in the eye and said, "I promise no hard feelings, buddy." After another deep breath, almost crying, he replied, "She and I have a prenup. I was very stupid to sign it, but if I file for divorce or leave her for any reason other than adultery on her part, all of our assets will be split 50-50, including my business. If she gets even half control of my business, or I have to buy out her share, and she'll retaliate against me for it, I'm sure I'll be on the verge of bankruptcy, and all the hard work I've put into this business over the past 8 years will be wasted. I've given it some thought. Would you mind giving me a copy of the prenup? I'll redact the names and have my attorney review it. I want to make sure I understand all the details before I advise you on what I'm suggesting you do." "Okay," he said, even smiling slightly. "By the way," I asked, casting the rod, "one more question. Since we're just talking about sports and trout, why did you marry her in the first place?" Jeff smiled even wider. "She wasn't always like this, although I had some hints that she could be a bitch. Still, I had my mind in a different place during the wedding. At the beginning of our relationship, and now, once every 2 weeks when she's not a demon, she's like a $10,000 a night call girl," he said, moving his eyebrows up and down. "Sorry I asked," I grinned. We then proceeded to discuss the problems with the quarterback of the local college soccer team. There are some people who believe that the sexier a woman is, the more spoiled and difficult she is. To prove their point, these people could use Rosalind as proof because, despite her pathetic personality and character, she is hotter than a forest fire. On our way back from fishing, we stopped by Jeff's office and he gave me a copy of his prenuptial agreement, from which I removed all personal information in his presence. On Monday, I took it to my attorney. It only took her 15 minutes to review it before she described the main points to me exactly as Jeff had done. I thanked her, invited her to lunch as payment, and then called Jeff to report back. At the end of our conversation, I said, "Jeff, I'm going to help you the way you helped me and get your ass out of your situation. It's going to require some unusual events, and some of the things I'm going to say to you in front of Rosalind won't make sense. Trust me." Jeff even grinned. "I trust you, man. Don't give me any details. Ignorance is bliss." Then it was my turn to giggle. I recruited our mutual friends without telling them what I had in mind. "All I need from you guys is a little patience if I act a little weird, maybe a lie or two, and if I need money, some donations." They all loved Jeff and were in solidarity. The first part of my plan was to get Rosalind as comfortable with me as her volatile nature would allow. To do this, I had to pretend that she was Jeff's full partner in helping me through my wife's death, although that was definitely not the case. She would swallow that, however, because she already had an inflated idea of her usefulness. The first thing I bought was a beautiful flower arrangement that included tulips, carnations, and roses, which over the years I had heard positive comments from Rosalind about. When I found out she was home and Jeff wasn't, I brought everything I needed with me to her house and rang the doorbell. "Lucas, it's a surprise to see you," she said in a tone that she thought was pleasant. "Hi, Rosalind, I brought these flowers for you." I smiled. "What?" "Oh, let me explain. While I would certainly be happy to give you flowers any time, I think Jeff would get jealous, so I didn't buy them. My company had a luncheon today, and it was a floral arrangement that the vendor put on the main table. I thought they would go to waste at my house, but since you helped me so much in my time of need, and I know you love flowers," I said to myself, "you should give them to Rosalind, and here I am." I lied. "Oh, they're beautiful," she exclaimed. "Come in, Lucas." She spent the next 20 minutes oohing and aahing, it really was an artistic composition, as we sipped our wine. In all the time I'd known her, I'd never seen her smile for so long. Finally, when I said goodbye, she gave me a real hug. "It went really well," I said to myself as I headed to my car. I was congratulating myself on a successful first start until I felt an uncomfortable sensation in my groin. I was getting horny as hell. That didn't make me happy, and my mood quickly soured. The next opportunity to get Rosalind comfortable with me came when I happened to be at a place she often went for lunch, usually alone since she didn't have many friends at work. It was a coffee shop where you ordered at the counter and then you could sit down and have your order brought to you. I waited until she walked over before I went into the coffee shop so I could already be there when she walked in. I waited until she walked in before getting in line so she would be right behind me. I stood in line looking forward, feeling her behind me. I turned my head to the side and she poked me with her elbow. "Lucas, what are you doing here?" she asked in a non-confrontational tone. "Rosalind? Wow, what a pleasant surprise." I was visiting a client, got hungry, saw this coffee shop, and decided to give it a try. I bought her lunch. We sat at the same table and had a nice chat about her work, my fictional client, and my reason for being at this particular coffee shop. She even smiled when I offered to walk her back to the office. "Just in case one of the many guys who see you gets lusty and attacks you," I smirked. That statement clearly pleased her, though she did respond with something like, "You must be blind." But she walked beside me and even took my hand as we crossed the street. As we approached her office, she smiled at me and gave me another goodbye hug. I waved and walked in the opposite direction to my car. "Another lucky contact," I grinned to myself. Then I felt the discomfort in my groin again and felt disgusted with my temporarily tight pants. The third encounter was on Saturday afternoon, when I sent Jeff off to play golf, despite Rosalind's displeasure. Rosalind loved theater productions, but apparently rarely went to them. I bought 2 tickets to an afternoon performance of Tennessee Williams' play The Glass Menagerie. The play was playing at our town's version of an off-Broadway theater. When I arrived at his house 90 minutes before the play started, Rosalind was surprised to see me. "Hey, Lucas, what brings you here?" "Just came by to pick up Jeff. Didn't he tell you we were going to the afternoon performance of The Glass Menagerie?" "What?" she practically screamed. "He's playing golf. He didn't tell me anything about it." She started breathing rapidly. I calmed her down, then pretended to call Jeff on his cell phone. In my fake conversation, I chuckled when I heard him say that he thought it was going to happen next week. I reported this misunderstanding to Rosalind, and she was obviously even more angry. After a few more soothing words on my part, I carelessly said, "Well, I guess I won't get to see it after all, because I hate going there alone." Then, as I turned to leave, I pretended it hit me and turned to face her. "Uh, Rosalind, I really want to go. I know it's a big inconvenience, but do you think you might have time to come with me?" Her cold stare at first made me think she was going to sling mud at me, but to my surprise, she said, "You can rest assured I would. That asshole Jeff never takes me to plays. What time does it start?" I looked at my watch. 85 minutes. I got there early so we could have a beer. "Give me 10 minutes, she cut me off. "Do you mind if I call Jeff back and ask if I can take you to the theater?" "You can if you want, but on the condition that you agree that no matter what he says, I'll go with you. Now get your ass over here, sit and wait for me, and don't even think about leaving me," she snarled. I pretended to call Jeff as she rushed up the stairs. Pretended Jeff said it was okay and let her go to the play. Ha ha. 10 minutes later, Rosalind reappeared. Despite her casual clothes, she looked like $1 million. Instead of coming in for a beer, we went in for a glass of wine and took our seats, the best seats in the room since the producer was my client, 5 minutes before the curtain rose. To say Rosalind enjoyed it would be an understatement. She was literally glowing most of the time, if you don't count the tears in her eyes. There was a happy ending in this adaptation where Laura does get married and Rosalind sheds tears of joy and is embarrassed that there are still tears in her eyes after the curtain call. We had another glass of wine each and discussed the play. Rosalind was more animated and cheerful than I have ever seen her. The only temporary disappointment was when I asked, "Should I call Jeff and see when he needs you at home?" "Hell no," she cut me off. "I'll decide when I get back." We talked for a good hour, sipping wine before I drove her home. She must have thanked me 10 times on the way back, to which I always replied, "I'm so grateful you agreed to come. I'd hate to miss it." When we pulled up to her house, before she got out of the car, refusing my request to go around and open the door for her, she thanked me again and gave me a quick kiss on the cheek before getting out. I shouldn't have had to watch her lush ass smoothly ascend the steps of her house. That, and her kiss, made the nasty pants tighten again. My attempts to ingratiate myself with Rosalind and gain her trust had been about as successful as I could have hoped for. I kept in touch with Jeff both in person and by phone, no texts or emails, so there would be no electronic trail. Jeff offered to take Rosalind up on what I was doing, but she turned him down. Jeff said with a puzzled look on his face, "She says I should be more like you, but then rejects me when I try to do it." "It'll be resolved soon," I smiled. "I think she trusts me now, so I hope to get the video and pictures you need next Thursday night when you're out of town." I smiled, then warned, "But I won't go into too much detail, so you'll be in a believable mood." My plan for Thursday, when Jeff was out of town, was to ask Rosalind to help me host a small client event. I was going to slip some ecstasy into her drinks and have a good-looking male chaperone, who I paid cash to take her to a hotel room rented under an assumed name and equipped with cameras to record them. I picked up Rosalind at my event around 5:30 p.m. This time, dressed up, she looked like $1 million. The male chaperone and every other heterosexual male at the event drooled at the sight of her. Around 7 p.m., I slipped some ecstasy into her drink. After I saw her take a few sips, and when she smiled genuinely at me, I was overcome with a sudden feeling of guilt mixed with emotions I didn't understand. It was then that I decided I wasn't going to follow through with my plan. I immediately found the male escort and told him to leave since I had already paid him. He looked disappointed, but I didn't care. I then went to splash the rest of Rosalind's drink and drive her home, but it looked like the drug had already kicked in. The ecstasy, however, had not had its usual effect. When I approached her to retrieve the drink, she began to speak slurred and suddenly passed out. Fortunately, I picked her up before she hit her head on the floor. I immediately took Rosalind to the emergency room. I pulled her insurance information out of her wallet, lied that I was her brother, and they took her to get checked out. I refrained from calling Jeff until I contacted the doctor. 3 hours later, the doctor came to me and informed me of what had happened. "This is a highly unusual situation," Dr. Ross said thoughtfully. "It seems that your sister had taken ecstasy. but it didn't affect her the way it does normal people. Normally, it decreases cerebral blood flow in the motor and somatosensory cortex, amygdala, cingulate cortex, insula, and thalamus, while producing high levels of serotonin. However, in your sister, it affected a previously unrecognized brain tumor that caused her to lose consciousness. I didn't understand much of what he said, but pretended I did. Then I asked, was she operated on? She had a brain tumor. We successfully and completely removed the benign tumor. It's amazing that she was able to function normally before that. I was amazed. What would be the normal consequences of her tumor? I inquired. There could be many, but one thing is for sure. It's almost constant irritability and possibly a temper as a result. Dr. Ross continued. Could this be the cause of a bitchy and unpleasant temper? I inquired. Not the words I would use, but generally yes, he replied. How long will she have to stay in the hospital, and how long will she take to recover from the surgery? She should probably stay here for another 2 or 3 days, and once she gets the anesthetic out of her system and recovers from the trauma of the surgery, she'll be better than ever. Probably 4 or 5 days after discharge, he replied. Our conversation continued for another 5 minutes, after which I was able to visit Rosalind about an hour after she regained consciousness and was already in her room. Before going into her room, I called Jeff, but the message went to voicemail. I left a brief message, but it contained all the medical information I needed. I was shocked at the impact my visit with Rosalind had had. She looked tired, but essentially no different except for the shaved part of her head. I felt a mixture of guilt, relief, joy, and, I couldn't bloody believe it, a tingling sensation that I hadn't felt in a long time and was hard to diagnose. A wide smile shone on her face. When I sat down next to her and took her hand, her smile grew wider, and before I could speak, she said, I remember when you drove me to the hospital. You were so warm and kind. You're my savior. I tried to object, but she put her finger to my lips and said, Don't try to deny it. Somehow my surgery has freed me in a way that I can already clearly feel, and I want you to know that I cherish our relationship that has developed over the past few months. Will you kiss me? Please do. I was amazed that without thinking, I leaned over and gave her a quick kiss on the lips. I stayed by her side for about an hour before the nurses kicked me out and told me I could come back at 9 o'clock the next morning. When I left the hospital, my mind was a complete mess, and I slept very poorly that night trying to deal with all the conflicting emotions plaguing my brain. The next morning, Jeff and I entered Rosalind's room at about the same time. The relationship between the three of us was a little strained as Rosalind treated me as her husband and Jeff as an acquaintance. When we were escorted out, we were both confused. After our visit, I told Jeff what the doctor had told me about the benign brain tumor. You should consult Dr. Ross in person, but it might mean she's not so bitchy anymore. It doesn't matter, too much water has passed, he replied. I was always nervous around her. Did you manage to get any pictures? No, she passed out, I told him, deciding to keep my refusal to accompany him to myself and try to undo what I'd done. Rosalind and I talked on the phone every day for the next 10 days. Sometimes I called her, sometimes she called me. All of the conversations were optimistic. I also talked to Jeff most of those days. Jeff said that Rosalind was definitely no longer bitchy, but she didn't seem to care if he was around or not. On the 16th day after her trip to the emergency room, there was a knock on my door around 10 a.m. on Saturday. I opened it and saw Rosalind dressed in a yellow-patterned sundress with a wide smile on her face. Hi, Lucas, she said in a low voice. Hi, Rosalind. Good to see you. Do you want to come in? Thank you, she said as I walked her into my living room. She sat in a chair for two, and I sat on the largest couch. To what do I owe the honor of your presence? I grinned. Well, I wanted to tell you about my progress and then ask you something, she replied with a smile. After giving up her drink, she spent the next 10 minutes talking slowly and briskly, describing how her life had changed for the better since the removal of the brain tumor. Life would be perfect if I wasn't married to Jeff, she continued, frowning slightly. Why do you say that? I asked. Jeff is indifferent and has been for the past few years, at least towards me. Besides, I've fallen in love with someone else. I raised my eyebrows instinctively. I didn't want to ask who, but curiosity got the better of me, so I did. A devilish grin appeared on Rosalind's face, and she stood up, took off her sundress, the only article of clothing she was wearing other than her 3-inch heels, and came over to me and sat on my lap. Stroking my face, she said, "Why are you being so silly? My mind couldn't handle the situation, but, I stuttered before she put an end to my torment with a passionate kiss on the lips. When she took a breath, she continued, "My question is, do I have a chance at a relationship with you?" There are probably heterosexual men somewhere who could resist Rosalind under these circumstances. However, considering that I hadn't had sex in over a year, that any sighted heterosexual guy would have rated her at least a 9-9 on a 10-point scale, and that I suddenly realized that even before her surgery, I had developed feelings for her, I wasn't that kind of man. I wasn't even thinking about my dear, sensitive friend Jeff as I kissed her with the passion of a love song. Soon after, I pressed my lips against hers as she lay sprawled out on my couch. As soon as my euphoria passed, I pulled away, quickly pulled off my pants, boxers, and socks, then picked Rosalind up and carried her to my bedroom. I really have no idea how long it took before we both physically relaxed and fully realized what was happening. I suspected we were back among the living when she gently kissed the tip of my nose, and her smile became as wide as the Mississippi. "That was fun," she giggled. I'd never heard her giggle before. "Besides, does that mean you're considering a relationship with me?" I thought for quite a while before her smile faded a little. Then I told the truth. "I have very contradictory feelings. I suddenly realized that I might already be in love with you, and if I'm not, I'm close to it," I started to say. Her smile, which was getting wider and wider, made me stop. I stroked her cheek and then said, "But I can't stab Jeff in the back, and there's one more thing you don't know about that might make you give up your relationship with me." A puzzled expression appeared on Rosalind's face, and she said, "Let's take a shower together, get changed, and then we'll talk about it, even if it takes all day and all night." I agreed, and we got our asses out of bed, and I turned on the shower to make sure it was warm enough for her before getting in. It was then that I took a long, leisurely look at her delicious body. She noticed me looking at her and rhetorically asked, "Do you like what you see?" "You look too gorgeous to even try to put it into words," I said, eliciting a wicked grin from Rosalind. I'd never been aroused 3 times in my life in 90 minutes, which was how long I estimated it had been since Rosalind had taken off her sundress. The sight of her gorgeous body in the shower and rubbing it changed that. We finally washed ourselves before the water got so cold we started to freeze, and wiped ourselves down with towels. She insisted that I give her one of my sizeless t-shirts. I'm 190 centimeters tall and she's 165 centimeters, and I just put on gym shorts. I made us sandwiches in my kitchen and we ate them, drinking iced tea and chatting amicably. When we were done, she asked, "Where should we talk?" "How about a crime scene?" I grinned, pointing to the living room. She grinned back and we walked in and sat next to each other on the large couch after I threw off my scattered clothes. I held Rosalind's hands and looked into her eyes. "Before I say anything else, I want you to fully internalize the following facts, as they all contribute to where we are now. 1, you used to be a real bitch, especially towards Jeff." She nodded in agreement with this statement before I continued. "No one knew it was because of the brain tumor, but that was the reality of the situation. 2, you are more beautiful than any woman in the world." She blushed and sighed modestly. "No, I'm not." But I interrupted her by gently placing my finger on her lips. 3, Jeff, along with my mother and sister, saved me after Sarah died. Without him, I never would have gotten through it. 4, Jeff really wanted to divorce you because of the way you treated him, but given your prenup that gave you half of his business unless you cheated on him, he couldn't afford it, I stated. "You know about the prenup?" she asked. "Yes, I read it and talked to Jeff about it." She nodded her head. 5, I was willing to do anything to help Jeff because he had helped me when I needed it most. 6, As part of my plan to help Jeff, by the way, he didn't know any details of my plan, only that I was going to help him, I started courting you. That made her eyebrows raise. I squeezed her hand. Before I get to the really hard part, number 7, I should clarify that although at first I was only trying to get you to like me, I started to have feelings for you despite your bitchiness. And so today, after the best sex of my life, after your surgery, and the tenderness that accompanied that sex, I know I've fallen in love with you. Can you believe it? Can you feel it? She smiled again. Yes, I can believe it because I could feel it overlapping with the sexual gymnastics we just did. Okay, now for the hard part. I really don't want this to ruin our relationship in the future, whatever it may be, but I have to be honest if we want to have any kind of relationship at all, even if it develops into a one-night stand and then you hate me. Rosalind had a puzzled look on her face as I sighed and continued. I then told her about how I had hired a male escort, slipped her drink, equipped her hotel room with cameras, and then changed my mind, fired the escort, and tried to throw away her drink when she fainted due to the effects of ecstasy combined with a tumor. When I finished, Rosalind stared at me in silence for an agonizingly long time. Finally, she said, "Well, I guess now that you've fucked me, you can tell Jeff to get a divorce." "No!" I bellowed louder and more sharply than I intended. "You're a different person now. I was already starting to look at you differently before your surgery, and now that I know I love you, if you don't leave me, I'm going to settle things between you, Jeff, and me. If you leave me, Jeff will never hear from me about what happened between us today." After a few more minutes of looking at me in silence, she said, "I have a lot of things to think about. I'll call you as soon as I come to some tentative conclusion." Rosalind took off her sizeless t-shirt, of course, flaunting her gorgeous naked body again, put on her sundress, and headed for the door. I gently grabbed her hand. "I love you," I whispered. She smiled lightly at me, gave me a quick kiss on the tip of my nose, and walked out the door. Despite the best sex of my life, which had ended a little over an hour ago, I felt like shit. My betrayal of Jeff, my near betrayal of Rosalind, and my weakness. I'd told her 3 times that I loved her, even though I'd only now realized it myself. All of it weighed heavily on me. I was more or less like a zombie for the rest of the weekend. However, I managed to pull my head out of my ass long enough to start formulating a plan in case Rosalind did contact me in the future. Monday morning, I delivered 2 dozen roses to Rosalind at her office. There was no message, just the imprint of a kiss on the card that came with the flowers. I spent the next few days worrying as I hadn't heard from either Rosalind or Jeff, but I was busy at work, and in my spare time I devised my plan. Thursday evening after work, Rosalind showed up at my house again. "Thanks for the flowers," she said with a faint smile. "I'm glad you liked them," I replied, walking out the door and gesturing for her to come in. We sat side by side on the couch in my living room. She didn't remove her hands when I took her hands in mine. "If you have a plan, I want to hear it," she said firmly. I shrugged and then replied, "I'll go to Jeff and tell him that I might be able to talk the new you into a divorce in which you split the assets 50-50, except that you'll leave his business alone, although you'll receive payments of 2% of its value every year for the next 10 years. If he agrees, the 3 of us have a conversation. At this time, you tell him that you've fallen in love with me and want to start a romantic relationship with me. I feign surprise, but show that I agree as long as it doesn't interfere with Jeff. If he doesn't mind, we could date for a couple months, and then you could move in with me. You and I will sign a prenup that protects us both, but will be more generous to you than the deal you make with Jeff." Again, Rosalind silently stared at me for a very long time. It was becoming her trademark. After a while, she said, "Actually, that's a good plan. However, I need confirmation that my last time with you was not an accident. Jeff is out of town tonight, so after you make me dinner and we digest our meals, we need to get back to your bedroom before tomorrow morning." When I woke up Friday morning, completely drained emotionally and physically, I wondered if I could survive a relationship with her. I was truly shocked that my plan had worked perfectly. Normally, you'd expect at least a little glitch. Jeff basically agreed to my divorce plan, even though I started out with 3% interest for 15 years, but he brought it down to 2% for 10 years, which is what Rosalind and I wanted anyway. The next meeting between the three of us was a warm one, and I thought it quite appropriate to feign surprise when Rosalind showed a romantic interest in me. The divorce that followed was probably the most amicable divorce ever, because the only serious financial issue was resolved, and neither Jeff nor Rosalind was interested in continuing their relationship with each other. Once the terms of the divorce were agreed upon and the papers were filed, I invited Jeff to dinner. "Jeff, something is really bothering me and I have a confession to make," I said as soon as our steak and lobster entrees arrived, which he enjoyed so much that he didn't turn me down despite what I wanted to say. "What's wrong?" He smiled before cutting off a piece of sirloin and dipping it in melted butter, presumably for the lobster. Before I could muster up the courage to answer, however, he expressed something resembling a smirk, though I couldn't tell for sure because he was soon chewing on the meat. "You're not going to bore me with the story about sleeping with Rosalind before you started negotiating the divorce, are you?" When my fork and lobster tail froze in midair, I almost choked. "Did you know?" I finally blurted out. "How?" Finished chewing and swallowing, he smiled and said, "You don't think I could have missed the way Rosalind was looking at you, and the fact that you looked happy for the first time since Sarah died, do you? You must have been having fun," he concluded with a chuckle. But, you could have walked away without paying anything from your business," I gulped. "Yes, embarrassing you by having to testify, and possibly ruining your newfound happiness as I worked for a year to get you back on your feet. Your offer was eminently reasonable, because Rosalind and I did have a few good years together. And after her surgery, my health improved quickly enough for me to stop taking my blood pressure medication, so I was happy as a pig to let you have her," he replied, before cutting off another piece of steak and dipping it in melted butter. Tears came to my eyes, and I said, "You're the best friend in the world," but he cut me short just before world. "Don't be mad at me, man." "Enough of this. Just name your firstborn after me. When will our local douchebags finally hire a quarterback worth anything?" Rosalind and I didn't have a period of pretend dating. She moved in with me as soon as the divorce papers were filed. There was a clause in the divorce papers specifically authorizing this. Thankfully, she never fucked me to death, although it wasn't for lack of trying on her part for the first 4 months of our sexual relationship. Even after 4 months, I easily came to the conclusion that I should propose to the hottest woman I'd ever seen, who was now, tumor-free, as pleasurable as she was sexy when my schedule was accelerated. After a wonderful lovemaking session, she found herself nose to nose with me. "There's something I haven't told you the truth about," she said with a serious expression on her face. I hadn't really lied. I had just been misinformed about the facts. All sorts of disgusting possibilities flashed through my brain. What is it, dear?" "I told you I can't have children. Since I'm 6 weeks pregnant, it just doesn't seem right." "You what?" I asked, clearly more excited than upset. "You're going to be a proud papa. You can't help it, stud," she grinned. "Will you marry me?" I blurted out, simultaneously jumping out of bed, running over to the dresser and opening the top drawer. I dropped the box twice before I finally got to it and opened it, revealing a diamond engagement ring with more carats than Bugs Bunny. She said with a thoughtful expression on her face. "Let's see. I'm in love, I'm having better sex than I have any right to expect, and I'm having a baby with you in a few months. Let me think about it." I tickled her until she screamed, "Okay, yes, I will marry you. Now stop this tickle torture and make love to your mom-to-be." I did. We didn't name our firstborn after Jeff. We couldn't think of a single decent name for a baby girl that was anything like Jeff. However, our son's name is Jeff Simon, and his godfather, Jeff Phillips, is proud of him. He has already earned a spot on the school soccer team, even though he is now only 2 years old. Jeff, his new wife Brittany, and their daughter, her name is not Rosalind, ha ha ha, are frequent guests at our house. I couldn't have been happier during the last 6 years of marriage to my wife, sexy dang Rosalind, who had no tumors.